Today's episode is slightly different from the previous ones with two different takes on the same questions. So this is a two-part episode. Part one begins with Dr. Su-Ming Khoo from Ollscoil, Gaillimhe, who will be talking to us about wide-reaching effects of coloniality and how she interweaves her teaching and research on political sociology and coloniality.
Su-Ming, you might talk to us a little bit about your research on social justice and development and your thoughts on this in relation to Palestine.
Okay, thanks, Emer and Stephen, for inviting me onto this podcast. I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to share a few thoughts. So, about research on social justice and development, yes, development studies, which doesn't just include sociology, but includes a broad range of other disciplines like economics, geography, politics. That's kind of like where I come from, my background. And my research and teaching are quite related. So I might talk, even though you've asked me about research, I might talk about teaching because I'm what you call an integrated scholar who sees the two things of research and teaching as the kind of two complementary things that are protected by academic freedom and also make up the discipline, what it is that we want to work on and continue in partnership with our students and with the colleagues, other researchers, and the public. So that's the broad idea of what, when you ask about research, what we are talking about is not kind of a thing that's separate from activism or separate from engaging with the public or separate from teaching and what I do with students. So I'm sorry if that sounds a little bit unclear and a bit too expansive, but that's really what it looks like in practice. So let me just go back to development studies then and what's going on with social justice and development studies and where I am with that. And so I'd say two broad currents that I've been engaging with since I started my work really in the area, which maybe was also informed by my own PhD research, which was an opportunity for me as an individual to go back and revisit the country of my birth and to try and understand what it was all about and to reconnect to people in a country that I was no longer living in, Malaysia. So I was born in Malaysia and I lived there until I was a young teenager. And then, like many Chinese Malaysians, I was sent to boarding school in England and then looked for opportunities later on to do a PhD, which I ended up doing at Queen's University in Belfast. So the PhD research really was about trying to understand my country and where my country was coming from and also where it was going to. And that's at the heart of development studies, is some sort of collective understanding of what good change is or better change is and how individual lives are entangled in some kind of collective vision or project to address problems and to move forwards in a progressive manner. The problem is that moving forwards is not always a straightforward proposition in a culturally, ethnically, and religiously divided society, which was also the last and most profitable of all of Britain's colonies. Well, not all its colonies. It still has some territories that it's occupying in one way or another. But certainly Malaya was a jewel in the British Empire's crown and one which was quite late to decolonize in 1957. So questions about colonialism. I know you probably will want to ask me about that later in the interview. So that was really where my beginnings were. And what's happening in development studies now, of course, is a big question about development and where things can go in a progressive direction when clearly history and countries' trajectories are not going in a straight line. So progress is not what it used to be cracked up to be. And things seem to be going in what many people feel intuitively is the wrong direction. And so how can you teach and understand a whole subject that's about collectively progressing when the situation seems to be full of dread. Dread is the idea that the future has become futureless, whereas development is about futures becoming more futureful. So I guess that's the kind of where research and all that is coming. And I'm also grounded in a particular approach to development, which is called the Human Development and Capabilities approach. And this approach developed from the ideas of the economist and philosopher Amartya Sen and his other collaborators like Mahbub Haq and Martha Nussbaum, as a way to offer a corrective to development that was too oriented towards the economy and measurable economic wealth, and therefore maybe treating people as just tools to get more wealth rather than being focused on people. So Sen and Mahbub Haq, well, Sen was invited by Mahbub Haq, the Pakistani economist, to rethink and recalibrate people's ability to evaluate progress and think and talk about it by starting with a different proposition, which was that we should always treat human beings as the objective, as the ends, and never as a means. So it's not to say that we don't care about the economy, but we only want the economy to be good if it's going to provide good opportunities for people to become more free. And by being free, we mean to people to be things and do things that they have reason to value. So that's a rather long-winded explanation of where we're at and how it relates to social justice. But that relates to the two components of what we would call the social, the collective imagining that everybody wants to get to a better place, right? And justice, meaning getting to a better place in a way that is more equitable and more inclusive. And also going back to Sen's really seminal work, not only Development as Freedom, the important book he published in 1999, but The Idea of Justice. In The Idea of Justice, a book that he published in 2009, Sen kind of argued with the liberal canon of justice philosophers, saying philosophizing about justice is all very well. He always came up with a unique way of labeling things. So even if he was being quite critical, people didn't necessarily understand it in that way because his language was kind of unique and complicated. But he called it a transcendental institutionalism. If you imagined that we all lived in kind of Greek temples of perfect justice and democracy, then we might be seeking justice as if the heavens would fall. So he starts with this idea, fiat justitia, pereat mundus, which is seek justice or make justice happen, even if the heavens, the world may perish. So he says, well, it's not good enough if the world is perishing. And what we really ought to deal with as a society is to seek justice in the form of reducing manifest injustice. And he called this realization-based comparisons. What does that mean? That means that the reality today ought to be better or more just than yesterday. And you can't talk about justice or think about justice and just let injustice mount up in horrible piles all around you, getting worse and worse all the time. So that's kind of where I'm coming from and where I think things are happening.
What you said just resonates so much, particularly what's going on in the world at the moment, and particularly in Palestine. And I really liked what you said about teaching centered. And could you maybe tell us a little bit about how you relate all of this and bring it into your teaching, and maybe if you do bring it into your teaching in relation to Palestine, or other examples of, can we even call it social injustice? I don't even know, like the genocide, I guess. So you might talk to us a little bit about that and your teaching and how your students respond when you do that.
So this isn't a specific, it didn't begin as a specific response to the genocide as such, but it began already quite a number of years ago when I started doing my MA in academic practice. And I wanted to do a reflective piece on what it means to teach human rights and development when society itself no longer seemed to want these things. So teaching human rights and development at the twilight of human rights and development. It seemed that these optimistic and future-full areas for teaching and learning and research were becoming dark and overshadowed and unwanted. And so I really had to kind of look into myself to ask myself, why do you insist on teaching this? Why do you insist on researching in this area? And also, I was getting some pushback about the courses that I was teaching. And I would sometimes get this question, Sue, do you really think you need to teach all these courses in human rights? Don't we have too many courses in human rights already? And my very annoyed answer, which I tried to kind of parse in a more diplomatic way, not very successfully, was, well, the only reason why we teach human rights is not because we have too many of them, but because we have too few of them. I revamped, the courses I was teaching also did come under pressure to become more streamlined and to fit within, programs that were being offered, and what to do with them if programs that were offering these, got shut down or threatened. You always have to show that you've got enough enrollment in your courses to keep your courses viable. So I offer a course on human rights and development, which is a course in applied human rights. And this was a course that was constantly being challenged, and I was constantly asked, why do you insist on this course? And it doesn't really fit into human rights, and it doesn't really fit into sociology, or it doesn't really fit into politics. And it's really about building a bridge between the islands of human rights and development. And these islands look kind of different. The development practitioners have projects and evaluations and programs and interventions. And then the human rights, island is kind of like mostly inhabited by lawyers, it seems. So what I try to do in the course is to build a bridge using the right to development, which is a right that everyone has to participate in a conversation about what development is about, but also to benefit from the fruits of that development. So it's a very powerful idea and a very inclusive idea, because it's called, the right to development is called, it's sometimes called a vector. So it's the means that puts all the human rights together and brings them forward. It's sometimes also called an umbrella. So it's it's where like all the rights can kind of shelter under it. Think about what do we mean by human rights, which can be terribly abstract. So if you want to bring it to the genocide, I mean, obviously, you can't talk about the right to health if healthcare facilities are being deliberately destroyed, criminally destroyed. If health personnel are being singled out and attacked and kidnapped. If anything is affecting the availability of healthcare, the accessibility of healthcare, the acceptability of healthcare, and the quality of healthcare. So it gives you a kind of more in-depth way of going into why this is a violation of people's rights, what a right really means, especially when you destroy people's ability to participate in their right and to benefit from their right. So it gives us a kind of a window into that, but also to go back to what the problem is with development. When I said it was a twilight and people didn't want to talk about development, or development was going in the wrong direction, because we had entered a period of what's people called post-development. But of course, just because you're over the colonial origins of development, which was a real historical fact, that the whole concept of progress and development was mired in a genealogy, a history of coloniality. And so development was there to develop resources for the colonial metropole, the center, to extract from the peripheries, from the colonies. And that's what development was. So when people realized this historical fact, it kind of got complicated. And this also is extra complicated in the situation of settler colonialism, where extraction was clearly premised on dispossession and elimination of native indigenous people and their exclusion from their resources and the benefits of development. So the whole question of what development could be about if this was the origins, I think, is still there, and it's particularly there in the context of the settler colonial, which is more salient in the Palestine case.
Thank you, Su-Ming. That's really interesting what you've been saying there. And to kind of come at it then to things that are happening at the moment in terms, I know global activism is another aspect of your work. And I suppose it's so relevant at the moment when even in the last week when we've had the Madeleine flotilla and this current attempt to march to Gaza. Could you talk to us a little bit about global activism and how impactful it is in general?
So thanks very much, Emer, for that question. Because global activism was also facing, a potential twilight situation or things going in the wrong direction situation. And as someone who teaches the theory of activism and the practice of activism in the light of the theory of activism, it's coming back to this twilight of human rights problem, because at the core of the global theory of transnational activism was this idea, this Enlightenment idea, modern idea, liberal idea that things are going in the right direction. On human rights language, non-retrogression. So it's come to a different juncture now. When you mention the Madeleine flotilla, which is an illustrative act of participatory protest from the grassroots, to when all the other avenues of telling our governments to do something, putting pressure on our institutions or organizations to do something, trying to restrain the corporate greed that's also part of the accelerator for war and for extraction, for settlement, and for occupation. All of those come into question when this whole narrative of, the system is working, when clearly you see that the liberal international order is not working. The sovereignty of the sovereign states has been captured for the benefit of particular enterprises and coalitions of interest that are murdering people, crushing their hopes and futures, and literally trying to make their lives unlivable and their futures impossible. So it means that people like me who teach about activism have to have other approaches or other tools. And we're seeing now a lot of books just coming out. There was a very nice little launch just a few weeks ago. Bristol University Press, who I published a bit with, had several books that come out by Peter Beresford, by Silke Roth, new books on trying to understand where we're at and trying to regather forces and to find out where social action can be coordinated if we can no longer rely on our governments or on the legal frameworks to do something. It's not to say that we don't continue to pressure governments or to use the legal frameworks, but it's clear that Israel, which has been illegally occupying territories, invading more territories, and now causing war, I mean, these are crimes of aggression, crimes against humanity, as well as, the big tariff crime of genocide. So where should we look to? So I think it really is about re-theorizing and seeing where it is that social action can begin, that collective action begins, and where else is there that we can identify social action that upholds the norms that are at the heart of human rights, that people are equal, they have a right to life, the right to life should not be taken lightly, that the right to life includes the right to the conditions for life. And the more broadly humane ideal, which is that, people have a right to live and a right to a livable life, and that the young people in particular have a right to a future. So territories and countries and peoples like the Palestinians, who are overwhelmingly young people, have a right to a future. With the Madeleine flotilla, the idea is, well, it's not the first time a freedom flotilla has been tried. And in a way, it's also testing the international norms of, and also maybe it's a little bit of an antidote to the dehumanization that is taking place in the eyes and hearts of every person who has been going through every day with a daily televised ongoing genocide, and the cognitive overload of that, and the kind of fatalism. So this something, a phenomenon in politics you might call liberal fatalism, which is this idea of, well, you can't do anything anyway, so it's an excuse for nothing being done. Because liberal fatalism is grounded on a kind of endgame of cynicism, that people will simply agree that, yeah, power wins and over the powerless. There's nothing you can do about that, so you might as well just be like that yourself, which is fundamentally robbing us of our humanity as people.
Thanks, Sue. That's great. So you've all encouraged us all. We've got to get out and do activism. Do you have any suggestions for specifically local activism or regional activism, national, international activism? Where should we focus? We don't have to focus on just one, but do you have a series of steps if you want to do local in Galway or local in Dublin or Ghent or wherever you are?
Yeah, so I think you can do all of them, and that they're complementary. If you think about like all the rights, being in the one umbrella, or this idea of the vector. So the right to development is a vector. So it's being part of something, but also when you're part of something, having this wider consciousness that a lot of other things need to get on board, right? So it's this idea of all rights interdependent and indivisible. So yeah, we have to stop the bombs, but we also have to get food to people. We have to stop them from killing the doctors and flattening the hospitals. But we also have to make sure that there's a supply chain. We all have our places of work, so obviously we can, and the places of study, to do what we can. So sometimes what we can do is pathetically little. It's really sad, but you still have to do it. And so start a letter, sign a letter, go and turn up, go to the door of whoever the most senior person you can find with your letter, with as many signatures as you have. Get other people to write the letter with you. Get as many people as you can to write the letter and sign the letter. Take the letter as far as it will go. Read out the letter to whoever you can force to listen to you, to you reading it out. If there's no one to listen, go out on the street. So there are these performative assemblies that we do, which we know don't immediately make any difference, but I think they make a difference to us, because we can remember, literally remember, become a member of something again, that we are still human beings who are affected by this. So little things. Because I have the privilege of working in the educational space, and that means taking that privilege and using it as best I can. And the privilege of that space is that we give people time to reflect. And activism doesn't just have to be fast, and impactful and reach impact, because a lot of this activism, it's impossible to reach the impact. And it's too possible to give up because the impact cannot be measured. All the protests against occupation have not made one jot of reduction of occupation or prevention of occupation or lessening of occupation. Does that mean that we shouldn't do it? Of course it doesn't. Because it's the least that we can do. And when you've done the least that you can do more. So in the educational space, I can allow people who are tired and burnt out and anxious to sit with those feelings and to learn more about what others have done in different and in similar circumstances. And to have time to reflect on the dilemmas of being an activist. Because thinking and doing are two different things. And you have to house them in your being, which is also a vulnerable and precious thing. Every being. You either start from every person matters, or you don't. So you can't sacrifice, your students or your colleagues or your friends to the cause too easily, because they are also precious, and they are the most important resource in any solidarity struggle, any struggle to to maintain any semblance of a world worth living in, and to maintain any hope. I've drawn a lot from a collective effort to write about our problems and to create a sort of like a manifesto for what we could do in higher education. And the first is to name our problems, because if we don't name them, the problems will definitely never go away. And then to courageously do what we can in our limited ways and recognize our limitations, and not to forget what needs care. And sometimes we need to step back and see what we can do for each other, and to bring to bear to make sure that we reduce harm and we try to somehow allow joyful flourishing even in really difficult circumstances. Because if you can't do that, then you can't be working towards a future where everyone has a right to flourish.
Yeah, thanks for that. I've got all sorts of ideas coming from that, but should we have like a sort of a Samud convoy situation where we get students together and we drive down to the Shannon airport and go, not here, stop it, because to look on is to consent to this. Or what I get that you want to have people's feelings in consideration here, but is it, like you say, we take the minimum and then do more. So what is the more that we can do? What is the more we should do?
Yeah, and more doesn't mean always more, fast impact. It also means looking after people, because there are some people who, because they are, on visas or they have a different kind of status, they can't participate in a Samud convoy, or it might harm them. So I think we do have to be aware of that too, that people have to take care of their possibilities for living too. But yes, I mean, yes to everything in a way, that if that's, and I think that's the beauty of Samud Convoy and the idea of Samud, of collective dignity in solidarity by appearing. It is very frightening though, because we are dealing with a power that is extraordinarily callous and brutal. So it has taken a lot of courage for those people to put their bodies on the line, because they are putting their bodies on a line and moving that line forwards towards a front line where bodies have been crushed. So we can't expect that of everyone. But for those who are brave, we can support them in every way that we can. And not everyone can participate in that. But yes, if some people do, then boost and amplify what they're doing. And that's what solidarity is. If you have something that you can give to support the flourishing and the needs of others according to their needs, then we do that. But yeah, it's a great, the Samud Convoy is a great idea. The Freedom Flotilla is a great idea, but also everyday actions, and also desisting from the thoughtless decline into cynicism is itself, I think, a really important thing that people can do every day. Not allowing hope to get destroyed, I think, is really important every day. And to see that the whole point is that, Palestinians don't want to be seen as, these victims who are nearly dead. They want to, they are teaching us life. So they want to be seen as people who are people, because they're like everyone else. They want to have life, live life, have joy, experiences. And, that is at the end of the day what the solidarity is. That's what I mean by everyone's right to flourishing. But yeah, Stephen, I agree that, it's become so urgent that it's obvious that people are just going onto the streets, and they're just getting in their cars and they're just going. And that's amazing. That's very powerful. It's empowering. It's hopeful. And yeah, it's very good. But yes, just to hold on to the idea that everyone has a right to enjoy the right to development, which is really about being adequately nourished, being able to be healthy. Obviously, if you're not alive, you're not healthy. Yeah. and to be educated. And I just I've been using in a lot of presentations, I mean, just some photographs of children and teachers resolutely studying and educating themselves in the most dire circumstances. And what is that? Only that it's about hope that we can actually agree that everyone has this right as equals, to be part of something and to participate in that in a meaningful way, and to maintain hope that they can have a future. So yeah, that's just the three immediate action areas. They are really, really important and easy way to approach what is the human rights all about. It isn't really about laws, but it's about people and their lives, and about recognizing that we are all people who are all entitled to being and flourishing in the same way.
And now for part 2 of today's episode, we have Dr David Landy, Assistant Professor in the Department of Sociology at Trinity College Dublin, who is here to talk to us about social justice, human rights, coloniality around the world and in Ireland today, and about academic activism. David, you might talk to us first about your own research on social justice movements in Ireland.
Thanks very much, and thanks for having me here for this series. So, yeah, my own research on social movements in Ireland and abroad is very much tied up with my activism in these movements. I mean, the reason, honestly, I became an academic is in order to find out about the movements that I was involved in. And the first thing I was interested in was I was kind of fascinated in, well, why do so many Jews around the world support Israel? For me, it was never a natural or normal thing. I'm Jewish myself. And so I was kind of fascinated at this idea of Zionism. Like, why was there such diaspora support for Zionism? And then I moved on because my research supervisor, who was Renate Lenton, she said, look, you're going to drive yourself nuts. If you spend 4 years researching Zionism, research anti-Zionism. It's much more interesting. And it's much more what you'd be interested in. And, Renate was an excellent supervisor, and she was right in this. So I kind of started researching diaspora anti-Zionist Jewish movements, and then moved on to researching social movements in Ireland, including the Palestine solidarity movement in Ireland. And I started doing some initial research on what the movement has been doing, and it's been doing an incredible amount. It's been a really astonishing movement of international solidarity in this country. What it's been doing over the past 2 years, over the genocide. When October the 7th happened, and when Israel started its genocidal attack on Gaza, the movement in Ireland was, in some ways, very well prepared, because it had extremely firm foundations throughout Irish society. It has been a very long-lasting movement. The movement isn't simply the main groups in the movement, but you could say that the tentpole group, the main group, has been the Ireland Palestine Solidarity Campaign, the IPSC, which was established over 20 years ago now, and which has worked very successfully with other civil society groups. But the movement isn't simply, one address. The IPSC itself has, the regional groups in the IPSC are more or less autonomous, I mean, everybody is very much more or less on a similar page. And beyond that, you also had various specific movements, specific groups established, like Trade Unions Friends of Palestine, the group that I helped establish, Academics of Palestine, another group which I reluctantly helped establish, which was Jews for Palestine, but I'm very happy exists now. I can talk about that later. And so you had these other groups there trying to mobilize certain constituencies, and you also, of course, had other organisations, like the very effective small lobbying group Sadaka, which actually grew out of a split from the IPSC. And you also had the various political parties running their more or less front groups. So you have like a really diverse landscape of organisations in Ireland on October the 7th. Now, of course, they weren't doing much because solidarity activism, like any other social movement activism, goes through downtimes, goes through periods of abeyance, and not much was happening before this. But you had sort of the organisational infrastructure. And then after October the 7th, what you've had has been an absolute explosion of groups and organisations. On one hand, you had like several direct action groups set up, which was really helpful and really useful because you didn't have these direct action groups like Palestine Action in the UK. So you had Dublin for Gaza, you've had Action for Palestine, I think. Yes, they share the same initials as Academics for Palestine, which was originally a front group of the of PBP, but then that kind of created an autonomous existence. You also had Saoirse on Palestine that was set up. So you had these kind of number of direct action groups, especially in the first 6 months, who were kind of running around doing sort of necessary disruptive activities. I know that ourselves in Dublin for Gaza worked very closely with the IPSC and tried to coordinate and to a certain extent ourselves with them so we'd be on the same page. And you also had a number of, let's say, so many different civil society groups set up, like Sports for Palestine, Healthcare Workers for Palestine. Literally, I'd say almost any profession and any activities had a For Palestine group set up. So you've had this really dense network of civil society organisations. And beyond that, you've had so much regional activity, which has been quite astonishing, to be honest. I was recently down at a group in Gorey. They were showing a film, the Oscar-winning film No Other Land, which, I don't know if you've seen it, is a very good film, very depressing. They asked me to come down, and I did, because the draw for me was Mary Manning was also speaking there. Mary Manning was, of course, the dumb stores worker who refused to handle South African goods. And, she, honestly, anti-apartheid was the first social movement I was involved in, and she'd always been a hero for me. So it was just a thrill to speak on the same platform as her. And what stunned me was, like, this is a group in Gorey. It was simply Gorey, nowhere else. And there were like 40 people there. And they said, oh yeah, no, we've only a hardcore of about 12 people. And you're going, Jesus. So you're having this thing replicated all across the country, north and south. This is a very dense network of activism, which is, not unprecedented for social movements, because social movements in Ireland have always been localised, but is hugely unprecedented for a solidarity group's solidarity action such as this. But I better stop talking now.
Wow, David, that's great. Thank you so much. There's several things you mentioned that I'd like to go back and touch on. One is, so several scholars I've read have talked about don't say diaspora, which originally is invented to refer to the various Jewish communities all over the place, because it reinforces sort of the Zionist rhetoric that all Jewish people must go to Palestine. So have you dealt with that a bit? But I'd also like to ask you about being Jewish in Ireland. But let's just start with the first question.
Sound happy to talk about being Jewish in Ireland and growing up Jewish here. But about diaspora, I mean, the Jewish diaspora preceded Zionism. And, in Hebrew, like, it's not referred to as diaspora, it's referred to as galut, which means, it's like in even harsher words, which means exile. We're in exile. But it was understood before Zionism, which, as we know, is a very modern nationalist movement, slightly 130 years old, was the first Zionist Congress, I think. Before, Zionism, it was understood that Jews lived in exile, but it was understood as a spiritual exile. And what Zionism did is it territorialized the spiritual yearning of a return to Zion. And like every year at Pesach, at Passover, Jews say next year in Jerusalem. But this was understood as next year the Messiah will come. Next year the world will be the world will be saved. Next year in Jerusalem was understood as I say, a spiritual demand. But what Zionism did was it territorialized this like understanding of this connection with this land of Israel, because the same way that Christians have a connection with the Holy Land, but it's not, and it's a real and it's a deep and it's a spiritual connection, same as Muslims, but it's also understood as not a wish to colonize these territories, or at least it's understood now as not a wish to colonize these territories. But in the 19th century, there was a lot of Christian Zionism. There was a lot of, we need to return to the Crusades. We need to take over this. And Christian Zionism was an important, early precursor of Jewish Zionism. The very phrase, what's the Zionist advertising catchphrase? Oh yeah, a land without a people for a people without a land. That was actually invented in the mid 19th century by a Christian Zionist, and then repurposed. So I suppose what I'm saying is this idea of diaspora and this idea of living in exile is a very Jewish concept. And when Zionism started up, the understanding, all nationalisms have an other, a thing that they are against. Now, the other of Zionism was not Palestinians, was not the Arabs, who were not even recognized. The other of Zionism was the diaspora. And this was the thing that Zionists were in some ways like fighting against. Zeev Jabotinsky, the right-wing founder of Reform Zionism, the way he put it was, we must, I don't think, I mightn't be quoting this exactly correctly, but we must eliminate the diaspora or else they will surely eliminate us. And by eliminating the diaspora, he didn't mean like doing an Adolf Hitler elimination of it, but he meant destroy this idea that the diaspora is where Jews live. Because that was the understanding before Zionism. Was the majority understanding. Zionism was originally a revolutionary nationalist thing that said Jews' proper place is not in the diaspora. Jews' proper place is in this country nobody has ever lived in, or very few Jews live in Asia. And so there was a new cultural template that was created, and there was a slew of anti-diaspora propaganda. So I think the idea of a diaspora, doesn't mean it necessarily originates from this territorial place. And in Jewish life, what there has been, especially over the last 20 years, has been a growth of so-called diasporist consciousness, being a diasporist being the alternative to being a Zionist. And the idea is that the proper place for Jewish people is in the diaspora. This is where Jewish life for the last 2,000 years has existed, and this is, in Daniel Boylan's phrase, the generation and the ground of Jewish identity. So while some people refer to global Jews, it hasn't really had much of a hold among Jewish people. But the idea of like diasporism as opposed to Zionism has been, a growing tendency among diaspora Jews.
Well, yeah, thanks. Of course, my immediate reaction would be, global Jews sounds like something an anti-Semite would say. So I'm like, careful now there. But before we move on to activism, I wonder if you would like to talk anything about the Irish and Jewish experience. I know a few people, and it's a very difficult experience for some because there was the mass movement to like New York in the late 1940s.
Sure. The Irish Jewish experience was one where a lot of immigration happened at the turn of the 20th century. And, when Ireland was part of the British Empire. And it's interesting when you're seeing the anti-Muslim rhetoric that's around now, that you can't be Muslim and Irish, because exactly, of the same rhetoric was used against Irish Jews. They come to live among us, but they will never be of us, as Arthur Griffith said about Irish Jews. And this was in the aftermath of the 1905 pogrom or boycott in Limerick in order to justify it. So there has been definitely an undercurrent of anti-Semitism, but this would be more experienced by my parents' generations. Like my mum growing up in the 1940s talked about how like the week before and the week after Holy Week the Christian kids wouldn't play with them because, you know, they're Jewish and they killed Jesus. Now when I was growing up in the 1970s there was none of that. And there wasn't this kind of this religiously based. I mean, there was certainly, you know, if you read McGrail's Prejudice and Tolerance in Ireland, there was still like the religious based anti-Semitism, especially in but not exclusively in rural areas. And most of the anti-Semitism would have been on the basis of the Jews killed Christ in this country. But this wasn't a really pressing issue, and this wasn't the reason why so many Jews in Ireland started emigrating in the 60s, 70s. The reason was the Irish Jewish community was just small. And, you know, its spiritual basis was more in Manchester than in Dublin. And there's a lot of connection with Manchester. And so, like, growing up in Ireland in the 70s, like, it was like growing up in a small village. And you'd be going out in the 80s, you'd be going out to parties and you'd be kind of going, oh, if I kiss that person, are they my cousin? this worry. People, because Irish Jews emigrated the same way a lot of other Irish people emigrated, mainly to Manchester and London. Some went to, as you say, America. Some went to a few, not many went to Israel. And that's the difference between, I think, being Irish Jewish now and when I was growing up. When I was growing up, Israel was very distant. You know, it wasn't really important. I remember we had in Chéide class, the equivalent of Sunday school, we had a young fella from Israel coming in, and he was shocked that we weren't able to even say yes or no in Hebrew, because the Hebrew we'd be learning would be all religious stuff. I mean, we could say, you know, David was the king of the Jews and he smashed the Philistines. We couldn't even say, hello, how are you doing? Because, you know, that they don't really exist in the Bible. So it was very much a Jewish identity based in Judaism rather than, as is now, based in Israel. That, you know, if we were asked, you know, and this was a common question we asked ourselves, you know, which side would you support in a war, Ireland or Israel? And the answer was generally speaking, Israel, because they'd win. You know, and the whole making joke work out of it indicate how, like, this was an identity to be played with, how Israel wasn't that significant or wasn't that central. And this has changed for Irish Jews, as it has changed for other Jewish communities, as Israel has been making increasing demands of the diaspora, seeing the Jewish diaspora as a resource it could put money into, but also draw upon. And this, I think, has radically changed what it means to be Jewish now. To be Jewish now means that you have to, you know, deal with Zionism one way or another. It's far more central now than it was, which, you know, is a shame.
Yeah, thanks. I asked that to sort of lead into the issue of how many Jewish Irish people you're working with there are supporting the Palestinian cause. I know of one anecdotally who went to a protest in Galway with his kippah on and was attacked wearing a watermelon kippah, and just going, okay, this is an issue. How can you get people to support if they're going to be attacked while supporting the same cause?
Yeah, no, that's appalling. And there's definitely anti-Semitism on the fringes of the movement. God, if I'm being honest, I'm surprised that there's not more. I'm very happy there's not more, but the amount there is has to be tackled constantly. I think I said at the beginning of the podcast, I reluctantly helped start the Jews for Palestine group. And the reason for my reluctance was that I was very happy in the Ireland-Palestine Solidarity campaign, where there have always been Jews, and the Jewish people have always been, understood as part of the campaign. I remember, God, this was 15 years ago. I was I was made chair of the IPSC, and was made chair is pretty much how positions in the organisation go. Yeah, it was my turn, and we thought it would be good to actually send out a press release, a kind of dog bites man story, Jewish head of IPSC. And I remember one of our group was really angry about that, and he was right. It actually was our treasurer, a very gentleman from Kerry, Martin O'Quigley, and he, like God, I'd never seen him angry before. And he was saying, "You're not here because you're Jewish. You're here because you're human, and as a Jew, you're here the same reason as I'm a Kerry man." Yeah. And it was understood that we were integrated and part of this. And as I say, I was happy with the situation. But people in the IPSC said, look, it'd be really handy having a special group, a Jewish group that we can kind of refer to. And so I kind of referred to this group as a banner group, jokingly saying, well, there'll be just enough of us to hold a banner up at demonstrations. And I think my main contribution to the group at the time was to suggest that we call ourselves the Jewish community. It was a double-edged joke. But because partly it was so that we could actually issue those press releases saying the Jewish community stands in support of Palestine, the Jewish community condemns Israel's attack. But it was also, it's a double-edged joke because we knew we weren't the Jewish community. But we also knew the so-called Jewish community wasn't the Jewish community. That the people who speak out as so-called Jewish community leaders are not representative of Jews in Ireland, any more than, let's say, I, with my radical anti-Zionist attitude, would be representative. Because it's wrong in some ways to talk of a Jewish community when it comes to Israel, because it's such a huge dividing line among Jews, and an increasingly bitter dividing line among Jews, not simply in Ireland, but worldwide. And so you're having our group, which was originally literally this banner group, and over the course of the last 5 years, what we've seen, those who've founded it, much to our surprise, is that by virtue of being this, pole of committed anti-Zionism, we've had Jewish people joining us, and a growing number of Jewish people joining us. And of course, this process has been accelerated with the attack on Gaza since October the 7th. It is a thing in activism, Palestine solidarity activism. The question is, well, which war did you join the activism in? Which was your war? I mean, for some people who I interviewed, it was back in 1973. It was that particular war. For other people, it was Lebanon. For myself, it was the Second Intifada. Other people, it was the Cas-led attack on Gaza. But that's always the thing that coalesces this vague sense of unease. It's what we call, I suppose, in social movement studies, the moral shock that pushes people into action. And so, yeah, we've had like a number of Jews joining us over the last year, and now we have quite a robust little group. It's actually a pleasure, and it's actually a joy to be able to talk to other Jewish people about these issues. To be honest.
Oh, thank you for that. That's great, yeah, because it is a problematic thing that keeps getting brought up, that every time you say, I'm pro-Palestine, you're immediately an anti-Semite. So I think it is important not to center Jewish feelings, as some say, but to show that it is not anti-Jewish to support Palestine. And with that, we'll give it over to Emer.
David, thanks for that. I know that you've also done a lot of research on human rights and discourse concerning immigrants and refugees coming to Ireland, as well as that concerning Palestinians. Ireland, I guess, is not, at the moment, I think, is not a very welcoming place for refugees, or for those even who are seeking economic improvement to their lives. Could you see any kind of equivalence between the pro-Palestinian movement in Ireland and this movement to support the end of direct provision?
Thanks very much. I'm going to be really annoying and I answer sort of one of the things that you said, which I think is really important, before moving on to what we asked Emma. And that was the issue about centering Jewish feelings. I agree with you. One of the reasons I didn't want to found the group originally was this whole thing of, Palestine is a Jewish issue and everybody else should just shut up. And this whole idea of centering the feelings, let's be frank, what's been centred a lot by the media hasn't simply been Jewish feelings, but the feelings of the people who have supported the genocidal state and feel a bit uncomfortable now about that and want to recuperate their moral capital, which they have spent by literally supporting a state that is committing genocide and calling those of us who've opposed the state, calling us the equivalent of Nazis. Those feelings should definitely not be centred. I think this is really important. So I don't think that a Jewish group has any special task to undertake except to allow other Jews to, join Palestinian solidarity and to emphasise, as our group has done, that this is not a Jewish issue. Just to I suppose agree with your point on that one, and then to get onto the issue of the odd thing of how Ireland supports Palestinians until they arrive in Ireland. The fact that a lot of the homeless refugees who have landed destitute on these shores, a lot of them, unsurprisingly, have been Palestinians fleeing for their lives, and the way that they have been attacked, their tents attacked by right-wing racists, and the Gardaí essentially looking the other way on this one. So international solidarity doesn't stop when it comes to our doors. So there's definitely a certain congruence, if that's the question you're asking.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think it's also just to lead into something that myself and Stephen had been thinking about, and it's this 7th century Irish law that calls for the protection of women, children and non-combatants in warfare. So we started mulling around ideas about that, and as Stephen rightly points out in another podcast episode, that young men deserve protection as well in this genocide that's happening in Palestine, and it's something that's rolled out all of the time. Why is it? I'm thinking in particular of those attacks on those men who were living in tents down by the canal. In any case, the mantra that was put out by the far right is, why are all these men here? It's because men are the first people who are able to travel normally when they're seeking economic and, more in this case, sanctuary. So could you talk to us a little bit more about human rights and how to view these people who are coming to our shores looking for protection? Yeah,
my take on human rights is less negative than it used to be. I used to be very suspicious, and I still am somewhat, of the humanitarianism discourse that surrounds people, especially in times of war. And when I say people, I think it was Cynthia McKinnon who coined the phrase women and children. This word which speaks of the only proper victims in war, women and children. But again, the women and children are massified victims. They aren't understood as individuals. They aren't understood as people who have, as Judith Butler's phrase, grievable lives. In other words, lives that are in themselves irreplaceable. They're just these massified victims. And as massified victims, so it doesn't really help women and or children, but it also very much excludes men from any concern of humanitarian access to humanitarian feelings, one could say. Men are not the proper victims. And there has been and this is one of the problems of human rights discourse, that the only people who are in some ways allowed be understood as subjects of this discourse are perfect victims. And so if you fight back, you're not a perfect victim. If you're potential to fight back, you're not a perfect victim. If you're involved in politics, you're not a perfect victim. And we don't need to look even far from our shores in relation to this. Like, I do remember the time of the Troubles when, let's say, loyalist paramilitaries would shoot somebody. Their relatives and their neighbours were always very keen to stress that they weren't involved in politics, as if this was somehow made them less worthy victims in a war. And so, yeah, no, there has been and it has gone on hand in hand with the demonization of Arab men that we have had, I was going to say, since 9/11. I mean, it preceded 9/11, but it's been especially virulent now that, like, Arab men are seen intrinsically not as humans, not as, part of a society, but like as problems and dangers to a society. And it's this discourse which, of course, sustains this right-wing nonsense of military-aged men, as in these are somehow, as I say, not humans, not part of society, but dangers to society. And so the way that especially brown men have been made this way is kind of horrific. And we saw in relation to the Syrian refugee crisis, if we cast our minds back so far to pre-pandemic times, it was very instructive for myself that I saw that the people who were involved in the solidarity attempts, the solidarity efforts, and there's, again, huge amount of society-wide solidarity being shown, they were all people I knew from Palestine Solidarity. I was going to say, well, if you did a Venn diagram, it would be a perfect circle of the people who are involved in groups like Ramsey, are in a lot of the other stuff, and people involved in Palestine Solidarity. Now, I think it mightn't be as much of a perfect circle now, but yeah, there's a huge crossover in personnel. Now, obviously, the different movements in that they're asking for different political objectives, but there's huge congruence, I guess.
You mentioned there brown skin, so I was hoping maybe we could talk about that. And it's one of the things that has struck me from the very beginning of this genocide, and I am talking about since the 7th of October onwards, the last 2 years, and looking at the images of children, women, young men, the whole state of Gaza. What aspect do you think that brown skin and race plays into public perception of Palestine, or public inaction, or state inaction?
That's a really good question, which is my way of saying I can't answer it, but I'd like to talk a bit around it. So on one hand, we have been having this massive public solidarity with Palestine, and it has been huge in Ireland, but it's been huge across Europe. I know that the original large Palestine solidarity marches in places like France and Germany were mainly not brown-skinned people, I suppose you could say. People from the Middle East, people from Asia, people from North Africa, whose parents were from North Africa, who were the backbone of this. And, more and more white Germans and white French have kind of gotten involved since, but it was significant how racialized that was, unlike Ireland. So if we're talking about the public perception in Ireland, I don't think that the brown skin of the Palestinians, and when we're talking about brown skin, we're not talking about actual brown skin. We're talking about how the perceptions of them are, and the perceptions of Jewish people, Israelis, should I say, is of being white. There's this, for me, quite annoying trend by white Jewish people like David Baddiel, for example, to claim that they're not white. And kind of going, you have to understand, you kind of going, do you know anything about race? That you know anything about the wages of whiteness or white privilege, which you have without doubt being benefited from, or which I have without doubt benefited from. Like having a certain cultural difference is not being white. So, yeah, having this perception, and God, I remember at the start of the attack on Gaza, and just a group of us in Dublin, a group of Jewish people in Dublin, we were just meeting and going like, what does this actually mean? And I came up with this kind of grim thing of like, well, because we were wondering, how many people are they going to kill? It's going to be at least 20,000. What's the highest number? And we were going, well, maybe 200,000, maybe up to that. And I would then added, like, well, if it's 20,000 Jews are still white, if it's 200,000, then we'll no longer be white. And this understanding that, like, those who supported the genocide would step back from it and then say, oh, this is just a Jewish genocide, it's just the Jews who have done this, and the Jews with their ancient atavistic religion and those, centre-right and right-wing people who supported Israel's attack would be the ones who step back and leave the responsibility towards Jewish people, racialising us in the process. Now, I don't think I was correct in this because they haven't stepped back. And this is something kind of fascinating to ask ourselves, why they haven't stepped back, why they still support this pure mass murder, this pure and very open genocide. Again, another thing I don't have the answer to. But one thing that I didn't consider back then is, well, if Jews aren't white, then we won't be permitted to commit genocide. Fortunately or unfortunately, Jewish people and Israelis are still considered as being white, and therefore still considered as, their actions are automatically legitimate in a way that, well, if they weren't considered white, there wouldn't be the parroting of Israeli army propaganda on our airways that we're seeing at the moment. So I know that doesn't answer the question, it's just some ruminations on it.
Thanks for that, David. So moving to something more specific that you will know well about is your activism, especially regarding Trinity College Dublin's recent announcement they're going to cut all ties with Israel. Can you walk us through this process and the outcomes? And, for example, will there be any exceptions to the cuts like UGent in Belgium had?
Thanks, yeah. Yeah, I can. I'm happy to talk about the activism and about can I introduce Academics for Palestine more generally, if you haven't been talking about that too much yet, because this is an example of where there was an organisation before October the 7th, but it has, flourished, mushroomed since then. The organisation was a very loose group of academics in various colleges, like one or two in various colleges scattered around, and we'd organise a few activities every year, usually bringing someone over. But it kind of gave a certain framework to what's happened since. And, one shouldn't praise one's own group, but we made the absolutely correct decision to move to campus-based activism very, very early on because we said, look, national activism. We are organised. We're not really organised by discipline so much. We're organised by universities. Universities is where the decisions happen, and these are the things we have to try and change. And so now, as you know yourselves, we have organisations, and quite strong organisations, in, I think, pretty much every university in Ireland, north and south. And the one we have in Trinity has been, I'll be honest, one of the nicest groups I've ever been involved in. It's always really nice to be involved in workplace activism, because then, the people that you do your normal dull work with, the ones who you forget to send the emails to and all that, are the people who you're also, really working with. They're not just your colleagues. They're in some ways, it's an old-fashioned word, but it's true, they're your comrades as well. And it makes working, and it makes the work environment so much better. Like, it's so wonderful that I know so many people now in various departments in university and have worked and have kind of struggled on this issue with. It makes the university and it makes the workplace so much better. So yay to workplace activism. And so I guess I talk about workplace activism because in Trinity College, in the decisions that were taken, the roles of the unions were central. Initially, there's as with other colleges, there's various unions representing workers, and in Trinity we decided to call ourselves Academia for Palestine, which is a terrible word, but at least keeps the AFP and keeps the fact that we aren't just academics. There's a number of professional staff that have been hugely active in our work in Trinity, and so you've had SIP2 and Unite in Trinity, who represent professional and college staff, who have also passed very strong resolutions, and whose representatives who were on this particular task force have been fantastic. Now, there was actually more of a fight to get IFOT in Trinity to support boycott, which was kind of unusual because you had IFOT nationally supporting the boycott of Israel before you had the Trinity group doing it. But, I suppose you just had an entrenched group of people, but honestly, they did come around. The union is, in the end, a democracy. So, on one hand, what you did have was unions initially supporting our right to protest, initially supporting a ceasefire, and then moving to supporting boycott. And equally crucially, if not more crucially, you had amazing student activism in Trinity. Now, you know the way student activism goes through ebbs and flows. Well, fortunately, it was like a high ebb. In Trinity, for activism, you had a very activist students' union, which was led at the time by Laszlo Molnarfi, this year by Jenny Maguire, who's also very involved in trans rights activism, and they were both great in keeping pressure on Trinity and engaging in very disruptive and very focused actions. For every single one of their actions that they engaged in, they had an ask. They had a specific demand they wanted. So it wasn't simply, which I remember from my days of, let's occupy a building and, oh yeah, what do we want? That kind of nonsense. So this was far better. And, when you have effective activism, you have students who are interested in actually getting involved. So, of course, the high point of the activism was the encampment, which was last May. And the encampment was using a previous repertoire of contention, which was blocking the Book of Kells, but not blocking it for an hour or two, but blocking it for days. And of course, the college went into overkill, initially fining the Students' Union something like 200 grand, and, shutting down Trinity College because of the encampment, which honestly was wonderful. It was wonderful walking through Trinity without tourists. I remember this year, the anniversary, just going, I wish they just do that again. And because of the high profile, because you had the fellows and other senior people in college saying you need to compromise, because you had the union saying, yeah, you need to compromise, and because of the united front the students presented, correctly, Trinity behaved differently to, let's say, American universities. I mean, they were never going to install snipers on the roof in Trinity College. And increasingly, it was obvious that they weren't going to bring in the guards in relation to this, so they had to negotiate. And the negotiating tactic was to set up a task force to look at stuff. And, oh my God, I have to say that was one of the most painful things I've ever been involved in, because, I managed to get on the task force not as a representative from Academics for Palestine because, they weren't there, but because the Students' Union seconded me. And so I was there with the Students' Union, with the other trade unions, on this particular task force, whose remit was to look at stuff. I'd like to say it was less broad, but it really wasn't. And you had, essentially most, if not all, of the senior officers of the university also there. And I think without doubt, the original idea of the task force was to drive the whole thing into the ground, was to just have meeting after meeting and then issue some kind of vague declaration that we're in favour of good stuff, but we have to consider everybody's point of view in this. And it was a mystery that this, to me, like, having been involved in, I don't know how many, 17 or 18 task force meetings, is a mystery to me to a certain extent why this didn't happen. And I think, like, I don't want to break confidence or anything, but like, when I think why it didn't happen, one was the United Front presented by the unions and Students' Union in relation to this. There was like constant arguing the kind of need to centre Palestine, the need to centre specific actions on Palestine, and a constant arguing why, the boycott was a commensurate response to the genocide, on one hand. But it also has to be said, the other reasons were there were people who were amenable in the end to be persuaded. On this one, there were no committed Zionists calling anybody anti-Semites for daring to stand up for Palestine rights. And so we have a different institutional context in Ireland that if we look at the administration in universities, what the administration wants is what administrations always want, which is business as usual. They want to be able to conduct business as usual. They want to be able to conduct things as normal. And they don't want disruptions to this, which, fair enough, to an extent. So there needs to be a lot of persuading why this is an exceptional circumstance. And there needs to be, and we need to understand, there needs to be a lot of persuading of academics who absolutely correctly stand up for academic freedom. Absolutely correctly say, it has to be an extreme situation before we'd break ties. We need to be able to explain why this is the extreme situation, why Israeli universities are so, how Israeli universities, should I say, are so tied up in the war effort. That maintaining ties with them is very much maintaining ties with genocide. And so, in some ways, the endless meetings gave us the painful opportunity to do so. And in the end, there was also the submissions, because the university asked for submissions from the college community. And so we read through, I don't know how many submissions, about 80 or so submissions, the vast majority of which were obviously saying, this is an exceptional circumstance like South Africa, or whatever arguments, and arguing for boycott. And there were very few that were arguing in a realistic way that this was a bad idea. So that was also an influence, that there was the understanding that, the view of the college community in relation to this. So in some ways, I would say, do not do this process. We've been talking to people in other universities, and we're saying, do not do this incredibly laborious, year-long process in order to get a boycott of Israel. But maybe, it necessarily will take a laborious process. And I would have to say also, I've said it before, but hats off to the unions, hats off to the student unions, who spend a lot of time, the various representatives, and name them, Jenny Maguire, John Walsh, Kieran Perry, Jack Ferguson, spent a huge amount of time, a huge amount of effort engaging with the process. And, we really didn't think it would pay off, but in the end, it did. So, in the end, what we won was, we agreed that current ties with Israeli universities and current contracts with EU Horizon and so on would not be affected. Now, we did this for two reasons. Firstly, because other universities like Barcelona University have tried and have petitioned the EU Parliament, the EU Commission, to get out of the existing contracts, correctly to say, to get the Israeli partners out of the existing contracts that they have with them, and the EU Commission has refused. So there's no point in saying we're going to try something that we know is going to be unsuccessful. But we're very happy that the task force recommended and Trinity Board agreed that the existing contracts, we can't affect them, that they would join with like-minded universities to lobby that Israel be excluded from future EU Commission funding, which is, fantastic, and that the university would not have any future research contracts with Israeli institutions insofar as is possible, because there's always the chance sometimes that an Israeli institution will be joined on later and we can't do anything about that. So there is a certain kind of having to be realistic. Similarly, with the existing research contracts, there's some existing mobility arrangements with Hebrew University of Jerusalem is one of them, which is like a terrible offender when it comes to supporting the attack on Gaza, and Baile Átha University as well. And again, we can't. There hasn't been any people going over to Israel over the last 2 years. So, while we can't particularly break this contract, maybe we could, but it would take a long while. There's a certain level of what's the point, and we'll let it run its course and not have any future ones. And so I think they were the main things. Besides that, it was agreed, but this was always going to be agreed, that we divest from Israeli companies and that we seek not to have Israeli suppliers. So it was a kind of a very full, very comprehensive win that, as far as we can see, though we'll be monitoring the situation, there will be no exceptions to.
That's great, David. Covered so much there, but just to kind of throw it a bit more open, do you have any final thoughts on the field of sociology and human rights current issues in relation to the genocide in Palestine? Or we're always very conscious that, of what's happening in Sudan and the Congo as well. If you had any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks. As I say, I've been quite critical of the idea of human rights and of how it channels activism in a certain way, and how, we're speaking the language of human rights, but also this is a language that speaks us and makes certain things, certain aspects of anti-colonial struggle unsayable and undoable. And in a recent article in Sociology Compass, I think it was, Yasmin Gunaratnam, it's a great article where she's talking about sociology and the war in Gaza. And she points out the fact that it is a very, very vanilla form of anti-colonialism that we're engaged in here. It's kind of the least we can do, which is, calling for a ceasefire, calling for a boycott of universities which are participating in a genocidal war, demanding that we have the right to speak up. Because in English universities especially, this is the fight. I mean, it's really simply demanding that they are allowed to criticize Israel in these profit-driven, value-neutral institutions that they're in. So the kind of anti-colonialism that we're calling for is very minimal. And it is interesting that it has called down such a response from the states that we live in. A greater response, of course, in European countries than in Ireland, very much more hostile response. But if you compare it even to the support for South Africa, where the support for South Africa and the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa was very much a support for an anti-colonial movement, that you can say with the necklacing and other things were committing huge human rights abuses at the time. And of course nobody virtually nobody in Ireland and absolutely nobody in academia is saying victory to Hamas. Nobody is saying victory to the resistance. Even like saying something like death to the IDF is absolutely, as we've seen, out of bounds. What we're engaged in is in a very constrained form of activism. Now, that's neither good nor bad, that's simply the fact. In relation to what sociology does and where sociology stands, what Yasmin Gunaratnam was saying was that it's very hard to actually apprehend what's going on in Palestine at the moment. That the distance, which, the old question in sociology about, what kind of distance do we take to the object of study, is a really pressing one in Palestine when we really don't know the object of study, where we really don't know what is happening and the effects of what is happening in Palestine. And the relationship, as between ourselves as Bure called sociology a moral science, I'm not too sure about that. But as a moral science, where does it stand beyond saying the kind of bare minimum of war is wrong, we shouldn't participate in genocidal war? Yes, certainly where the kind of sociology I would do would be less looking at what is happening over there and more looking at what's happening here in response, because it's so difficult to apprehend, so difficult to understand the horrors in Gaza, and taking a God's eye view of it is in some ways taking a sort of colonial view of it. And so the question is, what attitude, what position should we be taking in relation to Gaza? Again, I'm good at asking questions, but maybe not so good at answering them.
Thanks, David. That's just been absolutely fascinating to talk to you today. So many different aspects of what you said there resonate and are touched upon in some of our other podcasts or other episodes as well. From the history that you've given us of Zionism, that's been fascinating, to the history of the social justice movements in Ireland for Palestine even before the 7th of October. I think that really set the scene, and it was great to get a background on academics for Palestine, even though John Reynolds covers that in an episode as well. But it gave us a really strong insight into the group and all that you have achieved, and particularly in Trinity College and the recent developments there.
So thanks very much, David.
Many thanks to Sue and David for joining us today. Next week, we'll have Dr. Laura Matachney from University College Cork Archaeology and Dr. Patrick Bresnahan from Maynooth Geography, talking to us about archaeology and geography. We hope you see us then for the final episode of Series 1. Thanks. Lana Walia.